I stood alone at the top of the old royal observatory with a letter pressed flat against my ribs, inside my coat, where I could feel the shape of it every time I breathed. Snow was coming down in slow, deliberate flakes, the kind that seem to know they have all night to fall. Below me, the Capitol glittered in scattered gold, and above me, the dome had been rolled back on its ancient tracks so that the sky itself hung open like something finally allowed to exhale. I had never seen her face. 18 months of letters, and I did not know the color of her eyes, whether she was tall or short, whether she laughed easily or had to be coaxed into it. I knew that she drank her tea too hot and refused to admit it burned her tongue every single time. I knew she fed birds outside a window she never described in enough detail for me to picture it, that she hated formal dancing despite being, by her own grudging admission, very good at it, and that midnight was the only hour she ever felt entirely like herself. She had told me once that this was precisely why she wrote to me, that every other hour of her day belonged to someone with a request, and midnight was the one door nobody else had a key to. She had asked to meet at last. Her handwriting had been careful when she proposed it, the letters a little smaller than usual, as if she'd rewritten the sentence more than once before she trusted it. If either of us changes our mind after seeing the other, we leave the letter and walk away, no explanation required. I had thought it romantic when I read it in my kitchen, with my socks still on and the kettle going cold behind me. Standing here now, 30 years old and shivering in a coat that was not quite warm enough for a rooftop in the last week of winter, I thought it was closer to terrifying. I could still leave. I could turn around, take the narrow stone stairs back down through the observatory's dead machinery, and never know what she looked like at all. Some part of me, the part that had spent a career learning not to trust anything it couldn't examine under raking light, thought that not knowing might have been the safer choice for both of us. I came from a provincial mill town, where my mother had spent 20 years on a factory floor, owned, at several removes, by the Crown, using suppressants so thick they gave her headaches whenever aristocratic alphas toured the plant. I had grown up understanding, in a way that lived in my body, rather than my politics, that decisions made behind palace walls reached people who would never once be invited past the gates. I did not hate the monarchy. I had simply never trusted the shape of anything built to put one person permanently above everyone else, and I had spent 18 months writing exactly that opinion, in increasingly specific terms, to a woman I now knew had read every word of it from the throne. I did not leave. I had brought the final letter she'd asked for. The one instruction in her last message had been oddly specific, almost shy. Please bring the last one you write me, whatever happens tonight. And I turned it over once in my coat pocket like a coin I was deciding whether to spend. At midnight, precisely, I heard footsteps on stone far below, and then the unmistakable sound of more than one set of boots, moving with the particular discipline of people who are paid to notice every exit in a room before they notice anything else in it. My stomach dropped. I assumed, for one panicked second, that something had gone wrong, that I had wandered by accident into some royal security exercise, that the old observatory had been requisitioned for a purpose that had nothing to do with me. I actually looked around for a second door, some way to explain my own presence if I needed to. Then the footsteps stopped at a distance, and a single set continued on alone. The woman who walked through the observatory doorway wore a plain dark coat and gloves. Nothing ceremonial, nothing gilded. Her hair pulled back in a way that made her look almost unremarkable in the low light. And for one absurd second, I told myself, that's not her. That's just some official escorted here for reasons that have nothing to do with me. There was no crown, obviously. Nobody wears a crown to a midnight assignation in a derelict observatory. But there did not need to be one, because I recognized her the instant the light from my lamp reached her face, the way you recognize a mountain, even from an angle you have never seen it from before. She had forgotten to remove the signet ring. Queen Celestine Arden stood in the doorway looking at me with an expression I had personally described, in a letter to my own anonymous correspondent, as unreadable. And for one long moment neither of us said anything at all, because I was doing frantic arithmetic in my head that kept arriving, over and over, at the same impossible number. My first thought was not romantic. My first thought was, with something close to panic, why is the Queen here? My second thought, close behind it, was that I needed to leave before I accidentally did something that got me arrested. "You," she said, and there was real shock in it, which told me at least that whatever this was, it had not been arranged in advance at my expense. "You're number 42. I had corrected her once, publicly, at an archive exhibition 18 months earlier, for touching a 17th century letter without gloves. I remembered her face that day with unpleasant clarity, controlled, faintly annoyed, entirely unused to being told anything by a woman whose badge read conservator, rather than anything more impressive. She remembered it too. I watched the memory arrive on her face in reverse, the same recognition working its way through her from the other direction. "You're my pen pal," I said, and it came out flatter than I meant it to, my chest gone tight and strange around the words. "You are number 17. I am. You're the Queen." "I am that as well," she said, with the exact dryness I recognized instantly from her letters, and had never once, not for a single sentence, connected to the woman I had scolded in front of a room full of donors. "I did wonder whether you would prefer that I hadn't come at all." I nearly turned around twice on the stairs. I should have been able to answer that immediately. Instead, I stood there, while 18 months of intimacy rearranged themselves behind my eyes, all at once. Every confession, every joke that had taken 3 letters to build and 6 to finally land. Every complaint she had made about the exhausting theater of alpha expectation. Every sentence I had written to her, in good faith, about the Queen herself. I had told her, in ink, more than once, that the Queen always looked as if she expected betrayal from every room she entered. I remembered writing it late at night, pleased with the phrase, certain it would never travel further than an anonymous archive box. She had kept every one of those sentences. I could tell by the way she did not flinch from them now, the way a person does not flinch from a wound that has already scarred over and simply become part of the shape of them. There had been an alpha once, years before any of this, a colleague at a smaller archive who had decided my interest in his research meant something it had never meant, and who had used the low, easy pressure of his designation to make it difficult for me to say no in a room where he outranked me. I had left that job rather than keep negotiating around him. I had promised myself afterward, with the particular clarity of someone who has had to rebuild her own boundaries from nothing, that I would never again let an alpha's power stand quietly behind an alpha's affection without naming it out loud. Standing in that observatory, I understood that I was now facing the largest version of that exact problem the country had to offer, and that naming it out loud might be the only thing that kept me honest. "Say something only my pen pal would know," I said, because some small, stubborn part of me still needed proof, even standing directly in front of the proof. She was quiet for a moment, watching me the way I imagined she must watch rooms full of foreign delegates, reading for the true shape of a request underneath its words. Then she said, "You told me once that you fold paper stars when you're nervous, and that your corners are always uneven, and that you had never told anyone that before me. You said it was a stupid thing to confess to a stranger. I wrote back that it was the least stupid thing anyone had told me in years. I had never told anyone that but her. The grief that moved through me then had no clean name. It was not only betrayal, though there was betrayal in it. Not because she had lied to me, exactly, since neither of us had ever technically lied, but because the person who had made me feel most known in the world turned out to be attached to a face printed on every currency note in the country. It was not only humiliation, though I felt that too, hot and immediate, thinking of everything I had confided about the Queen specifically, to the Queen specifically, believing the distance between us to be as wide as an ocean. And underneath both of those, infuriatingly, stubbornly, was the same warmth I always felt reading her handwriting, entirely unbothered by any of it, as if my body had simply decided the facts didn't matter, and my mind hadn't managed to catch up yet. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked. She asked it plainly, without performance, the way a person asks a real question instead of begging one. "No," I said, before I had consciously decided to say anything at all. She did not move closer. I noticed that, and filed it away, the way I file away anything that tells me something true about a person's hands. She stayed exactly where she was, near the door, as though she understood that closing the distance herself, tonight of all nights, would be its own kind of pressure, and she had promised me, or promised the version of me that existed only on paper, that she would never use pressure like that. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. We ended up sitting on opposite sides of the old observing platform, close enough to talk without raising our voices, far enough that neither of us had to decide, not yet, what closer would mean. She told me, without my asking, that she had joined the correspondence project the ordinary way, an anonymous registration slip filled out in her own hand, a random number assigned by a clerk who had no idea whose pen was moving across the form, because the one thing she wanted more than anything else in her adult life was a version of it where nobody was arranging anything on her behalf. Even the project's coordinators, she said, had never learned that participant number 17 sat on a throne 3 days out of every week and signed treaties on the other 4. "I don't know what to call you," I admitted, when the silence had gone on long enough to become its own kind of statement. "I can't call you Your Majesty, not after everything I've written to you, but I don't think I can use the name from the letters either. Not yet. It feels like it belongs to someone I haven't met." "Then don't use either," she said. "For 1 hour, don't call me anything at all." "That isn't really an answer to the problem. The problem isn't the title," she said, watching me with a steadiness that made it hard to look away. "The problem is that you now know the woman who read your letters can, before breakfast most days, order half this country to do something it very much does not want to do." I had not expected her to say it so plainly. I had braced, without meaning to, for reassurance, for some gentle insistence that none of that mattered between two people who already knew each other's worst nights. And instead, she had simply confirmed the exact thing I was afraid of, without apology and without softening it for my sake. "Then don't forget it," she added, and something in the flatness of the instruction told me she meant it kindly, not as a warning meant to frighten me off. She was not asking me to pretend the gap between us did not exist. She was asking me to keep my eyes open inside it, the way she clearly had to, every day, about everything. "Do you think we lied to each other?" I asked her, once the cold had stopped feeling quite so sharp against my face. "Not on purpose, but by omission. Every word I wrote you was true, and I still wasn't telling you the whole truth about who was reading it." She considered that with the same care she seemed to bring to everything, turning it over before she spoke. "I've asked myself that for 18 months, she said. "I think anonymity made honesty easier for both of us. I don't think it made it dishonest. There's a difference between not being able to say your name and choosing to hide something true. I never once hid anything true from you. I only ever hid the crown. That's a very convenient distinction for a queen to land on." "It's the only one I've got," she said, and there was no defensiveness in it, only a kind of tired honesty that undid some of my anger despite myself. "I've spent 8 years being watched by people who already know exactly who I am and still can't see me at all. You knew everything that actually mattered about me and nothing that didn't. I'm not sure I can regret that, even tonight." I didn't have an answer for that yet. I still don't know that I fully do, but I remember thinking, even furious, even cold, even certain I should leave, that it was the most honest thing anyone in a position of power had ever said to me without being asked twice. Before I left, she reached into her coat and produced a bundle of paper tied with plain thread. My own handwriting, all of it, 18 months' worth. Every letter I had ever sent to number 17, kept in careful order. "They're yours," she said, holding them out. "If knowing who read them changes what they meant." I looked at the bundle for a long moment, cold air moving between us, snow settling on the sill of the broken window behind her shoulder. "No," I said finally. If they meant something to you before tonight, you don't get to pretend they didn't, just because I'm angry. I turned and went back down the observatory stairs before she could see what my face was doing, and I did not look back to see whether she watched me go. I did not sleep. I walked home through streets going quietly blue with early morning, past bakeries opening their shutters and a night tram running nearly empty, and by the time I let myself into my apartment, I had cried exactly twice and was furious about both occasions equally. Talia took one look at me across the reading table the next morning and set down the acid-free folder she had been labeling. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said. "Or worse, you look like you saw an ex you're still in love with." "My pen pal is the Queen," I said. She laughed. A real, unguarded laugh. The kind you give a joke you're certain must be a joke. And then she looked at my face properly and stopped laughing entirely. "You're serious." I showed her the letter I still had in my coat, the one I had somehow carried down the stairs with me instead of leaving behind the way I'd been instructed to, if I walked away. Talia read it twice, slowly, her mouth moving slightly over certain lines, the way it did whenever she was genuinely rattled. Then she put both hands flat on the table, the way she did when she needed a surface she could be certain of. "Do you understand what happens if this gets out?" she said. It was not a question. Not what happens to her. She has a country to absorb it for her. What happens to you? They will decide within a week whether you seduced her or she manipulated you, and they will spend the rest of the year arguing about your family, your income, your designation, and whether you're fertile enough to be interesting. I understood. I had understood it standing in the observatory, watching a line of guards keep a respectful, terrible distance from the only woman who had ever known me without an audience present. "So what are you going to do?" Talia asked, more gently now, once the first shock of it had settled into something closer to worry. "I don't know yet." "That's allowed," she said. For a little while, anyway. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand once, hard, the way she'd done since our first year training together, back when neither of us could afford our own equipment and shared everything, including the fear that we'd chosen the wrong careers. For what it's worth, the version of you in that letter sounds like she was already halfway in love before she knew any of this. I don't think that part's going to just switch off because of who signs the royal decrees. That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be comforting, she said. It was meant to be true. I can do comforting after you've eaten something. 3 days later, I had to attend a formal reception at the archive, the kind held twice a year for donors and dignitaries, and I watched the Queen enter the room the way I had watched her enter dozens of similar rooms before, except now every part of it read differently to me. The exact posture. The voice pitched for carrying without appearing to try. The practiced blankness of a woman who has learned, the hard way, that any expression at all can become a headline by morning. I thought, with something close to grief, that the woman from the letters had simply been swallowed whole by this one, and that I had been foolish to expect anything else. Then she passed my restoration table, where I had been folding a small paper star out of scrap vellum without noticing I was doing it, and without turning her head, in a voice pitched for me alone, she said, "Your corners are uneven." I very nearly laughed out loud in the middle of a royal reception, which would have required an explanation I was in no way prepared to give the room. The private woman was still in there. She had simply learned, out of long necessity, exactly how much of herself she could afford to let the public version see, and how to smuggle the rest through in 6 quiet words. We did not fall into each other's arms. That would have been easier, in its way, and neither of us reached for the easy version of anything after that. Instead, we made an agreement, awkward and specific, the kind 2 careful people make when they have already been reckless once and no longer entirely trust themselves to survive being reckless a second time. We would keep writing, but under our own names now, no numbers, no protection of anonymity to hide behind. We would meet, occasionally, and I would choose the places, and she would come without turning the meeting into a state occasion, whenever her security could be persuaded to allow it. It turned out we knew each other's private terrors in exhausting detail, and almost none of each other's ordinary facts. I discovered that she was taller than I had pictured, that she genuinely could not sleep the night before a major address, and paced her private study until nearly dawn. That unexpected touch made her flinch in a way she was visibly ashamed of, and that her laugh, when it escaped her guard completely, was warm and a little too loud, and almost nobody alive had heard it more than a handful of times. Her scent reached me before I admitted to myself how much I liked it. Pressed violet leaves, bitter bergamot, old paper warmed under lamplight, and underneath all of it, the clean mineral cold of snow just beginning to melt. I learned, slowly, to separate the pieces of it. The bergamot came out stronger when she was amused and trying not to show it. The cold sharpened when she was afraid. She discovered that I talked to documents while I repaired them, quietly, the way some people talk to plants, and that I could not hide irritation from my face, no matter how hard I tried or how important the room. She discovered that I would cross the city on foot for a bakery pastry that cost less than the polishing bill on her signet ring, that I cried at orchestral music and denied it fiercely afterward, and that I touched the corner of any letter before I said something difficult, as if the paper itself could brace me first. She came to the archive one evening after closing, when the building had gone dim and echoing, and I made her wear conservation gloves before she got anywhere near the 17th century correspondence I was stabilizing that month. "You scolded me in public for this exact thing," she said, amused despite herself, working the gloves on with visible unfamiliarity. "You were touching 400 years of history with bare hands." "I am history," she said. That, I told her, was exactly the attitude I objected to. She laughed properly then. The real one, the loud one, and I felt it land somewhere under my sternum and stay there. I showed her how to mend a tear along a fold line using wheat starch paste and a sliver of Japanese tissue, guiding her hands with mine, and for one long moment our fingers rested less than an inch apart on the same fragile page, and neither of us moved first, and neither of us moved away either. "You wrote to me once about a letter you'd repaired that made you cry," she said, not looking up from the tissue under her fingertips, her concentration almost comically fierce for something so small. "A soldier writing home. You never told me his name." "Corporal Aldrich Venn," I said, 300 years dead. He wrote to a woman named Josie every week for 2 years and then simply stopped. And nobody in the archive has ever found out why. I used to make up better endings for them in my head while I worked. "Did you ever write me one of your invented endings?" "No," I admitted. "I was saving that one. I don't know what for." She looked up at that, and for a moment neither of us was doing anything with our hands at all, the letter forgotten between us on the table, her face close enough that I could see exactly how her composure worked, not as an absence of feeling but as a kind of discipline, laid carefully over the top of it, the way I laid tissue over a tear. I thought, with a lurch that had nothing to do with archival ethics, that I wanted to close the last of the distance between us right there among 400-year-old paper. She seemed to want the same thing. I watched her almost decide it. Then a guard's radio crackled faintly in the corridor outside, and the moment folded itself carefully away again, unfinished, the way we were apparently going to keep leaving things unfinished for a while yet. I took her on a public tram one night, with her security trailing several cars behind at a distance she found visibly humiliating, mostly because I wanted to watch her fail at something ordinary for once. She did, magnificently, feeding coin after coin into a ticket machine that had not accepted coins in at least a decade, while an elderly man behind us cleared his throat with increasing impatience. 2 seats away, an Omega textile worker was telling her friend that the Queen's newest labor reforms had finally made scent suppressants optional on the factory floor, and that her mother would have wept to see it. 2 seats further back, someone else complained bitterly about the cost of the coming Jubilee. Celestine listened to both conversations without once defending herself, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and I understood, watching her, that she wanted the unfiltered version of her own country more than she wanted to be liked by any single part of it. Another night, after a state meeting had run absurdly long, she brought me into the palace's private kitchen at 2 a.m, the staff long since gone home, and attempted, with visible and entirely misplaced confidence, to make grilled cheese. She burned it thoroughly on the first attempt, and set off a small, dignified amount of smoke on the second. "You negotiate treaties for a living," I said. watching her scrape char into the bin with wounded pride. And you cannot manage a sandwich. Treaties rarely require butter, she said, which struck me as so genuinely absurd that I had to sit down at the counter to laugh properly. Why did you join the letter project in the first place? I asked her, once the smoke had cleared and we were splitting the one slice that had survived intact. Because everyone who already knows my name wants something from it, she said, without hesitating. A vote, a favor, a photograph, an heir, eventually, if the newspapers have their way. What did you want from me? Nothing, she said. That was the first beautiful thing about you. She was quiet a moment, turning her cup slowly on the counter. Then I wanted your next letter, and then I wanted the one after that, and I stopped being able to remember what it had felt like before I had something to look forward to. We went back to the observatory on a clearer night, weeks into this strange, careful courtship, and she showed me the exact stretch of sky she had once described in a letter, the fixed point that never seemed to move while everything else wheeled slowly around it through the winter months. Standing close enough that our scents finally mingled properly for the first time, I felt my own instincts respond to her far more strongly than I had prepared myself for, a kind of low, insistent pull I recognized and did not entirely trust. She noticed. She always noticed everything about me. It was maddening, and deliberately put a careful foot of open air back between us, giving me room I was simultaneously relieved and furious to have been given. I traveled that spring to a flooded provincial archive to help stabilize water-damaged royal correspondence, and Celestine, who happened to have entirely legitimate state business in the same region, spent one full day there with me, unwatched by any cameras, trailed only by two guards who kept a respectful, almost invisible distance. An elderly Omega librarian told her, to her face, without a trace of deference, that her mother's economic policies had ruined the region's mills for 2 generations. Celestine listened without flinching, and without excusing either herself or her mother. "Why do you let people speak to you like that?" I asked her afterward, once we were alone in the borrowed archive van, rain streaking the windows. "Because a monarchy without criticism," she said, "is just theater with better lighting." I began, slowly, over the course of that long drive back, to understand exactly what she had given up by refusing for 8 years to name a consort. Not romance, not really, but the specific, curated silence that comes with a partner the Privy Council has already approved and sanded down to nothing objectionable. At a formal state banquet I attended in my own professional capacity, invited for my expertise rather than as anyone's date, I heard 2 minor nobles discuss, over the soup course, whether an eventual Omega consort would require fertility testing before any wedding announcement could be made public, in a tone better suited to appraising livestock at auction. Celestine, 3 seats down the long table, said one sentence, quiet, precise, unhurried, utterly unforgettable to everyone within earshot, that ended the conversation entirely and, I later learned, ended 2 minor appointments within the month. She never raised her voice once. I understood, watching her do it without so much as setting down her fork, exactly how much of her restraint was a choice she made fresh every single day, rather than some inborn coldness the newspapers liked to write about. Earlier that same evening, before the soup course, I had watched a striking alpha ambassador from a neighboring court spend a full quarter hour at Celestine's elbow, laughing at things that were not especially funny, touching her sleeve twice in ways that were technically permitted and somehow still proprietary. I had felt something small and unflattering tighten in my chest, watching it, and had been irritated at myself for feeling it at all, since I had no public claim to defend, and had told myself repeatedly that I wanted none. Celestine had caught my eye once across the room, midway through the ambassador's 3rd anecdote, and something in her expression, dry, apologetic, faintly pleading for rescue, had undone the tightness in my chest more thoroughly than any reassurance she could have offered afterward in private. I did not need her to belong to me in front of a room to know, watching that one look, exactly where she would rather have been standing. The country, meanwhile, was hurtling toward its own reckoning, regardless of either of us. The 10th anniversary of Celestine's accession was approaching, with a winter jubilee planned across the capital to mark it. and Parliament was in the middle of a bruising debate over the Royal Partnership Reform Act, a bill that would finally strip away the old constitutional provision giving the Privy Council authority to subject any Royal Omega partner to invasive medical review, fertility assessment, and formal political vetting before a bond could be legally recognized. Celestine had quietly championed the reform for years, long before any of this began. It was, she admitted to me one night in her study, the actual reason she had never named a consort at all. She would not hand someone she cared about into a process built specifically to strip away the last of their privacy in exchange for a title. Lady Octavia Rhine, Chancellor of the Privy Council and once a close and trusted advisor to Celestine's own mother, opposed the bill with the calm, unshakable certainty of a woman who believed herself the last responsible adult left in the room. She did not want Celestine for herself, and she did not, in any personal sense, particularly care who I was. That, in its way, was the most unsettling part of her. She viewed me as dangerous purely because I was uncontrolled. No aristocratic family behind me, no formal vetting, no willingness to disappear quietly into protocol, the way generations of careful courtiers had. A monarch, she told Celestine once. In a conversation Celestine repeated to me almost word for word months later, still visibly angry about it, does not get a private self. That was never part of the arrangement. Octavia had served Celestine's mother for nearly 30 years, and I came to understand, over the following months, that her opposition to the reform bill was not cruelty in any simple sense. She genuinely believed the institution survived only because its private feelings remained permanently subordinate to its public duty, and she had watched, at close range, the damage done when earlier generations of the royal family had let sentiment steer policy. She was wrong about what that required of Celestine now. I never once doubted, even at the worst of it, that she believed herself entirely right. It was midway through the Jubilee preparations that the first fragments of letters began appearing in the newspapers. Harmless lines at first, romantic and slightly wistful, enough to send the entire capital into a fever of speculation about the Queen's mysterious secret correspondent. Then the excerpts turned dangerous. One appeared to show Celestine admitting she intended to interfere illegally with Parliament's upcoming vote. Another made it sound as though I had been quietly advising her on political strategy for months. A third suggested she meant to choose an Omega consort specifically to sway public sentiment ahead of the reform debate, as though our entire correspondence had been a calculated instrument rather than two lonely people finding each other in the dark. I read the third excerpt 3 times before something underneath my panic caught. Quiet and insistent and entirely professional. The punctuation was subtly wrong. Ink density does not lie the way memory does, and the photographed pages showed inconsistencies no single writing session would ever produce. Sentence fragments that had almost certainly been composed months apart, stitched together into a paragraph that had never existed as one continuous thought in either of our hands. I had spent a decade of my working life learning to detect exactly this kind of forgery in documents 400 years old. I had never once expected to need the skill for something written specifically about me. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, with a magnifying loupe and photographs printed off a newspaper's website, of all things, tracing individual letter forms the way I would for a disputed royal will, and feeling something close to relief underneath the horror. Whatever else had been taken from us, the letters themselves, the real ones, the ones that mattered, were still mine to defend with the one skill nobody could take back from me. I called Talia at 2:30, and she came over without asking a single question, and by dawn we had a working list of every inconsistency I could prove, without yet knowing who had built them. Celestine's security team wanted to move me into the palace immediately, under formal protective custody. I refused outright. She accepted my refusal, and then, without telling me first, used emergency royal authority to seal the correspondence archive records and temporarily restrict access to my entire department at the archive, genuinely believing she was protecting the remaining evidence and stopping further leaks before they could do more damage. I learned about it from my own supervisor, standing in the reading room with a suspension notice in her hand, rather than from Celestine herself, and something in me went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season outside. "You didn't ask me," I said, when I finally confronted her that evening in the same private study she had let me into exactly twice before. A normal partner can make a bad decision, Celestine, and apologize for it over dinner. You make a bad decision on a Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday, it's government policy affecting people who have never met either of us. She tried, at first, to explain the security logic behind it, her voice measured in the way it went when she was reciting something she had already rehearsed for a committee. Then I watched her actually hear what I had said, and stop mid-sentence. "I was frightened," she said finally, quietly, and I reached for power because it was the thing closest to hand. It was easier than sitting still with being afraid. "That is exactly what powerful people always say afterward," I told her, and I meant for it to wound, and it clearly did, and I did not take it back. That night, going through the box where I kept everything she had ever sent me, I found the letter where she had first called me by the private name we'd settled into, somewhere around the 8th month. "Mender," she'd written, "because you keep telling me about paper you've saved from ruin, and I keep thinking you'd know exactly what to do with me. And reading it now, after the sealed archive order, after finding out from my supervisor instead of from her, the word felt like an accusation instead of an endearment." She had mended nothing. She had, without meaning to, taken the exact shape of the harm I'd spent my whole career learning to prevent, and applied it to my own life instead. And the letter that had once made me warm from the inside out now made my hands shake so badly I had to put it away in a drawer I didn't open again for a week. We stopped writing to each other after that. For the first time in nearly 2 years, days went by with no letter arriving on my kitchen table, and the absence sat in my apartment like a piece of furniture I kept walking into in the dark, sharp-cornered and entirely unmoved by how much it hurt. Octavia, sensing weakness, gave Celestine an impossible choice in the days that followed: confirm publicly that the correspondence had genuinely been romantic, and hand Reform's opponents a ready-made weapon to claim she had rewritten the country's law for her own lover, or deny it outright, and let the bill survive on whatever merits it still had left on its own. At a press conference I watched, unable to look away, from my own kitchen, Celestine said that the correspondence had begun anonymously, through a cultural project many years earlier, and should not be interpreted as evidence of any official royal relationship. Every word of it was, technically, entirely true. A reporter near the front asked, directly and without any softening, whether she was in love with her anonymous correspondent. She did not answer. The silence stretched 2 full seconds before an aide moved the conference along. I turned off the screen before the segment even ended. I did not blame her. Not really. Not even in the moment, for refusing to hand the entire country a private confession that belonged to both of us and to neither of them. What hurt, what settled into me slowly over the following hours, was understanding, finally and completely, that the Crown would always find some reason to make us smaller and more manageable, and that I might spend the rest of my life waiting patiently for whichever reason came next. I wrote her one final letter after that. Not cruel, though I wanted it to be. Some ungenerous part of me still does when I remember writing it. I told her that I had fallen in love with a woman who had no title anywhere in the margins of a page, and that I did not know whether that particular woman still had enough room left inside a queen to keep existing. Then I stopped writing altogether, and did not send another letter for 11 days. She did not chase me. She did not appear at my apartment uninvited, did not have me watched or followed, did not use her scent or her authority, or any of her considerable resources to make herself impossible to avoid the way another kind of alpha might have. She wrote me one letter, exactly one, and gave it to Talia to pass along, telling her plainly that I could read it or burn it, whichever I preferred, and that she would not ask which I had chosen. I read it 4 times, sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, before I could bring myself to set it down. She wrote that the Crown had taught her, from a very young age, that every problem could be solved by surrendering the correct piece of herself, one careful amputation at a time, and that she had very nearly done exactly that to us, the same as she had done it to nearly everything else in her adult life, without ever quite noticing the pattern. She said she did not know whether she deserved another letter from me, and that she would understand entirely if there wasn't one. She said she would go on correcting the harm regardless. whether or not it earned her anything. She signed it, simply, Celestine. Not Queen Celestine. Not the private name from our letters that I still had not once let myself say out loud, even alone. I did not answer her right away. Instead, deliberately, I went back to the forgeries, because it was the only part of this entire disaster I still knew exactly how to fix with my own two hands. It took nearly 2 more weeks of careful, unglamorous work to trace the paper stock itself, a fine, slightly yellowed sheet that matched, fiber for fiber under magnification, a damaged collection of royal stationery I knew for a fact had been quietly withdrawn from general circulation years earlier, after a burst pipe in a storage room nobody outside the archive even remembered existed. Only someone with genuinely privileged archival access could have obtained loose sheets from that specific collection. The access logs, once I finally forced their release through channels Talia knew far better than I did, led directly to an office under Octavia's control. She had not forged the letters with her own hand, as it turned out. A junior palace archivist, cooperating under unbearable career pressure and the quiet promise of a permanent posting, had assembled the composites out of genuine fragments of real correspondence, cutting authentic sentences into a shape that had never once existed as written. When I finally found her, frightened and close to tears in a records room after hours, she gave me everything within the first 10 minutes, relief plain on her face the entire time. Celestine and I had to work together again after that, whether either of us felt entirely ready for it or not. It was strange, walking into her private study for what turned out to be only the 3rd time. The bird feeder actually there, exactly outside the window, swinging gently in the wind. The shelf of embarrassingly lurid mystery novels she had always insisted, in her letters, were intellectual exercises. The blue lamp she had once complained about at painful length, the worn chair by the fireplace, where, I understood now with a small physical shock, she had spent hundreds of separate midnights writing to a stranger she hoped, more than almost anything else in her life, would never disappoint her. Every anonymous detail I had carried in my head for a year and a half suddenly had a physical address, and I had to stand still in the doorway for a long moment just to let that fully land. We worked for hours that night, mostly in silence, laying out evidence across her desk with the particular careful focus of 2 people who did not yet fully trust themselves to say anything more personal than absolutely necessary. I fell asleep eventually, slumped forward over a table of photographed fragments and comparison notes, and when I woke there was a blanket draped carefully over my shoulders, and Celestine asleep upright in the chair across the room, not beside me, not touching me at all, sitting exactly as far away as respect seemed to require of her. It mattered more to me than almost anything she could have said. We went down into the sealed royal archive together not long after. With emergency legal authorization Celestine had pushed through in record time to secure the original correspondence registry before Octavia's remaining allies could interfere with it any further. A sudden winter storm knocked out roughly half the building's power partway through our search, and the security shutters between sections slammed down on their own automatic failsafe schedule, leaving the 2 of us alone in the dark stacks with nothing but emergency lighting and the very real possibility that a triggered fire suppression system somewhere above us would ruin 4 centuries of original paper before either of us could reach the master valve to stop it. I knew every turn of those particular stacks, blind, the way I knew the layout of my own kitchen. Celestine, for all her authority everywhere else in that building, did not, and for the first time since the observatory, I was the one leading, and she was the one following, half a step behind me through the dark, her hand occasionally finding my shoulder to keep her bearings. "Left here," I told her, feeling my way past a row of climate-controlled cases by memory alone, the emergency lighting throwing everything into a thin red twilight that made the familiar shelves look like something out of one of her terrible mystery novels. "There's a step down in about 6 paces. Don't trust your eyes in here tonight. Trust me." "I generally do," she said, and there was no irony in it at all, which struck me as strange and steadying in equal measure, coming from a woman half the country still believed trusted no one. Somewhere above us a valve groaned and a fine mist began sifting down through a ceiling vent 2 aisles over, and I felt something close to real fear for the first time that night. Not for myself, but for the boxes of correspondence stacked along that particular run of shelving, the earliest surviving royal letters in the country's history, irreplaceable in a way that made my chest ache just to think about losing them to water damage over a political feud that had nothing to do with the 17th century. We saved what we could reach in time. I physically caught a box of loose correspondence as it slid from a buckling shelf, and Celestine, trying earnestly to help, very nearly destroyed an original document by grabbing at it with bare hands out of pure adrenaline, forgetting everything I had ever taught her the moment the alarms began. "Gloves," I snapped, more sharply than I meant to. She stared at me, startled, one hand still hovering over the fragile page. "I don't care if the entire monarchy collapses around us right now," I said. "Put on the gloves." She laughed then, right there in the dark, with alarms sounding somewhere above us, and water beginning to hiss faintly through the ceiling pipes 2 rooms away. And for one absurd, steadying second, it was exactly like any other quiet evening we had spent together. And it settled both of us enough to finish the work properly. We recovered the original registry entirely intact, undamaged, its seal still unbroken. It proved beyond any real dispute that the leaked letters had been assembled from correspondence written many months apart. Tucked inside the same box of records, we also found an authorization bearing Octavia's own seal, dated and unmistakable. In the last frantic minutes before the shutters finally reopened, a falling shelf mechanism caught the edge of Celestine's hand as she shoved me clear of it. A shallow cut, nothing serious, though it bled enough to frighten me badly for a moment, and I spent the long walk back binding it myself with strips torn from my own scarf, while she sat very still on an overturned crate and let me, watching my face instead of her hand. "I wasn't afraid for the crown back there," she admitted quietly, once the bleeding had stopped. "I thought you were going to disappear under those shelves before I could reach you." I very nearly kissed her then, in that cold, wet, half-flooded corridor, with sirens still faintly audible somewhere above us. I stopped myself at the last moment, because trust is not repaired by a single good night in the dark, however desperately it wants to be, and I was not willing to let one good night pretend to be more than it was. The Jubilee arrived in a blaze of lantern light and foreign delegations, banners strung across every major avenue in the capital, with Parliament's final vote scheduled for the morning immediately after. Octavia, cornered by then and visibly running out of time and allies, released the single most damaging forgery yet during the celebration itself, a letter appearing to show Celestine explicitly promising me a royal title in direct exchange for influencing Omega advocacy groups on her behalf ahead of the vote. It would have finished us both, cleanly and completely, within a single news cycle. Instead of letting palace officials speak on my behalf, as protocol clearly expected, I chose to speak for myself. Celestine did not ask me to, and I found out afterward that she had specifically told her advisors not to pressure me either way. I decided entirely on my own, at a nationally broadcast historical exhibition connected to the Jubilee, in front of live cameras and half of Parliament, and a great many people I had spent my whole career quietly avoiding, I laid out the physical evidence exactly the way I would for any forged document that had crossed my restoration table. Paper age, ink layering under magnification, fiber inconsistency, the telltale watermark, the impossible seams where separate authentic sentences had been cut and rejoined into something neither of us had ever actually written. Talia stood beside me the entire time, holding up the comparison boards with steady hands. I explained it the way I would to a first-year apprentice, slowly, so that anyone watching at home without a single day of archival training could follow every step. How a genuine letter's ink settles unevenly into paper fiber over the course of one sitting, and how a forged composite betrays itself in the seams where 2 separate sittings, months apart, have been pressed together into something that only looks continuous at a glance. I held up the watermark under raking light for the cameras, the way I had once shown Celestine how to mend a tear, and felt something settle in me that had nothing to do with politics at all, only the old, familiar satisfaction of a document finally telling the truth about itself. The frightened young archivist confirmed, on the record and in front of everyone, that Octavia had personally ordered the composites built from real correspondence. Celestine turned to Octavia in front of all of it, in front of cameras broadcasting to the entire country, and her anger, when it finally surfaced after weeks of careful containment, was nothing at all like a raised voice. It was worse than that. It was controlled, exact, and utterly without any mercy left in it. Octavia did not apologize, not even then. Not even cornered with proof laid out in front of half the government. "Everything I did was for the crown," she said, chin lifted, entirely certain of her own righteousness even in defeat. "A monarch does not get a private self. She never has." "Then you have fundamentally misunderstood what a crown is for," Celestine answered, her voice carrying easily across the hushed hall without ever rising. "It is something I wear. It has never once been permission to erase the woman wearing it, and if that was the arrangement you believed you were protecting, then you were protecting the wrong thing this entire time." Octavia was removed from the Privy Council within the week and placed under formal investigation for misuse of state resources and forgery. The reform vote proceeded the following morning exactly as planned, and the Royal Partnership Reform Act passed by a wide, and, by the standards of that particular parliament, almost embarrassingly comfortable margin. The old provisions for mandatory medical scrutiny and council approval of any royal partner abolished for good, though not everyone in the country cheered for it, and Celestine, to her credit, never once pretended that they would. When reporters asked her again afterward, in the calmer days that followed, whether the authentic letters had truly been romantic, Celestine did not erase it a second time the way she had at the earlier press conference. She said, simply and without qualification, that the correspondence had been personal, meaningful, and entirely real, and that the woman who had written the other half of it owed the public nothing further about her own private life, and that she would not name me publicly unless and until I chose to be named myself, on my own terms and in my own time. Watching from home that evening, I did not turn off the screen this time. I watched all the way to the end. We did not reconcile in front of any of it, in front of any camera or reporter or waiting crowd. Days later, once the exhibition halls had emptied and the Jubilee banners had begun coming down along the avenues, I sent her a short letter asking her to meet me at the observatory again, at midnight, the same way we had the very first time. She came alone through the door while her security waited well outside on the stairs, and I was already standing exactly where I had stood nearly a year of letters ago, holding the very first anonymous letter she had ever sent to me, the paper gone soft and slightly translucent from handling. "I don't want to date an anonymous fantasy," I told her, before she had even fully crossed the threshold. "And I don't want to date a crown either. I want you, the woman who terrifies half of Parliament without raising her voice, and the woman who burns sandwiches at 2 in the morning, and the woman who used to write to a complete stranger at midnight because she genuinely could not sleep otherwise. All of it at once, with no separate rooms left to keep any of it in. I can't promise you the crown will never complicate this again," she said, coming closer now, slowly, watching my face the entire time for permission. "I've made too many promises like that already, and broken most of them without meaning to. What I can promise is that I won't hide behind it a second time. I can promise to tell you when duty and love are pulling in genuinely different directions, instead of quietly deciding for both of us the way I did before." "And when you're frightened?" I asked. "I tell you," she said, "before I issue a national order about it." I laughed despite myself, the sound cracking a little in my throat, and that was when I finally closed the last of the distance between us. I kissed her first, deliberately, after 18 months of letters and a year of near disaster, and for one long, suspended second, she simply let me, before her hand found my jaw with a gentleness that undid something in me I had been holding carefully braced for months without admitting it. We stood beneath that open dome for a long time afterward, foreheads together, her scent settling around me at last like something finally allowed to land properly, instead of hovering just out of reach, and I cried a little, unable to stop it, and so, very quietly, did she, and neither of us minded in the slightest. Later that same week, I took the letter with the word "mender" out of the drawer I had shut it into and read it again, and found, almost to my own surprise, that it had gone back to being an endearment rather than an accusation, not because anything about the sentence had changed, but because I finally understood the shape of the woman who had written it clearly enough to trust what she'd meant by it the first time. When my scheduled heat arrived some weeks later, we planned for it together the way we had learned to plan almost everything by then. Carefully, in advance, with me holding every decision about my own body firmly in my own two hands from the very first conversation. I chose Celestine, in the end, over an empty room down the hall or a distant one across the palace. She asked, with almost unbearable care and no trace of assumption, exactly what I wanted from her: privacy, distance, scented clothing, physical comfort, herself, some combination of all of it. And when I finally told her, laughing despite the fog already gathering at the edges of my thoughts, to stop asking permission before every single breath, she informed me with perfect, straight-faced gravity that she would require clarification on precisely how many breaths were permitted, without prior approval. We laughed more than anything else that entire week, in between everything else. Whatever passed between us beyond that stayed ours alone. What I can say honestly is that it felt entirely unlike anything I had once feared an alpha's closeness might be, and felt, instead, entirely like something I had chosen with my eyes open. When the country began asking, months afterward, whether I intended to become royal consort, I refused outright to let the question decide the shape of my own life for me. I kept my post at the archive, exactly as before. I kept my apartment for a long while, longer than anyone at court expected me to, and I attended the state events I genuinely chose to attend, and corrected palace protocol often enough, out loud, in front of advisors, that Celestine's staff eventually started watching me the way you watch an approaching change in the weather. When we finally sat down together to negotiate what a shared future might actually look like on paper, I asked for my own independent income, my own professional voice in matters that touched my expertise, no fertility expectation of any kind, no suppressants required for anyone else's comfort at court, and no automatic political role attached to my name. Not because Celestine needed any convincing on a single point, but because she agreed, quietly and immediately, before I had even finished reading the entire list aloud. Our life together, once it finally settled into something like a shape, looked less like the fairy tale the tabloids kept trying to write, and more like two stubborn people slowly making room for each other. My books ended up scattered through half of Celestine's private rooms, spines cracked in places she still hadn't learned to avoid when she borrowed them without asking. She kept a small tin of the cheap bakery pastries I loved hidden in the palace kitchen, refilled every week by a member of staff who had long since stopped asking why. I still made her wear gloves around anything older than a decade, on principle, even when it made her advisors visibly uncomfortable to watch a queen take instruction from anyone. She kept writing me letters, ridiculous, unnecessary letters, even on days we saw each other for hours at breakfast and again at dinner, because midnight, she told me once, would probably always be the hour she trusted most with the truth. I left my replies folded under her breakfast cup more mornings than not. Paper stars, my old nervous habit, started turning up, uneven-cornered, in the margins of briefing folders nobody had the nerve to ask her about, and every so often, a genuinely terrible mystery novel would appear on my side of the bed with no explanation at all, which I understood, by then, to be its own kind of love letter. We bonded, eventually, privately at first, in a small room with no ceremony and no audience at all, both of us entirely lucid and entirely certain, with nothing biological or instinctive deciding it for us in advance. Before it happened, Celestine asked me one last, careful question, her thumb moving over her signet ring, the way it always did when she was nervous. If there were no palace at all, no title, and nobody watching either of us, would I still choose this, exactly her? I told her I had chosen her before I had ever known her actual name, on the strength of nothing but her handwriting and 18 months of honesty, and that nothing since had changed the answer, only made it heavier and entirely, permanently mine. A year to the night after that very first midnight, we went back to the observatory together, just the two of us. There was no ceremony this time either, no banners, no crowd, only the two of us, and the old correspondence box Celestine had quietly restored and set beneath the dome exactly where the guards had once stood watching from a distance, and a single sealed letter she handed me the moment we arrived, before either of us had said a word. You've spent the entire evening with me already, I said, turning the envelope over once in my hands. Why write a letter as well? Some things, she said, are still easier to tell the truth about on paper. I don't think that will ever entirely change, and I've stopped trying to make it. Inside was no decree, no formal announcement, nothing that belonged to the crown at all, only an ordinary future, written out plainly in her own familiar hand. Breakfasts, most mornings, whenever state business allowed it. Arguments about books neither of us would ever fully agree on, conducted over the same cooling pot of tea. Complaints about palace humidity slowly ruining good paper, mine mostly, hers occasionally. More midnight conversations, for as long as either of us still needed them, which she suspected would be the rest of both our lives. Growing old together, in whatever shape I wanted that to eventually take, at whatever pace felt honest to both of us. She had left the very last paragraph blank on purpose, and told me, quietly, that the rest of it simply could not be written by one person alone, no matter how carefully that person tried. I took the pen from her hand without saying anything, and I wrote beneath her final sentence, under that same open sky, in the same observatory, where a stranger had once walked through the door, instead of the ordinary woman I had been expecting to find waiting there. No longer numbers, no longer titles, no longer any imagined, safer version of each other standing carefully between us. Only the two truths we had spent 2 long years learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, to hold at exactly the same time, in the same 2 hands, that I loved her, entirely and on purpose, and that somehow, impossibly, I had already known her long before I ever learned her name.